Anna Zalek could not be here, who teaches at York, but we're lucky to have Lana Goldberg fill in. Lana is an environmental justice and Indigenous solidarity organizer, and she's been involved in a lot of campaigns, in particular the No Tar Sands, No Line campaign in Toronto. She was also, as many of you know, was very active in the Occupy movement.
So, for all of these reasons that have been outlined, the climate impacts of the tar sands, the impact on Indigenous communities in the area that are seeing high rates of cancers and other illnesses, and the violation of treaty rights, people across the continent are organizing against the tar sands. Of course, the most important organizing is happening at Ground Zero, and Heather mentioned some of the cases, the Beaver Lake Cree, the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, and there are some others as well. And in addition to that, there's also the pipeline organizing, and Keith explained the logic behind that. That's to basically prevent the ability of tar sands companies to get the product out, and if they can't get the product out, they can't build new tar sands mines. And in fact, earlier this year, before the prices of oil tanked, we saw 3 projects get shelved partly because of a lack of pipelines to get the product out. So we know that this works. And just to give a broad overview of pipeline resistance across the continent, I'll go over some of the struggles, and Keith mentioned a lot of them. So westward, we have the Northern Gateway Pipeline, and we've seen a lot of opposition from Indigenous communities, from organizations, and I think one of the most significant resistances is the Stoughton Camp. This is an area of northern British Columbia where people from the Stoughton Nation and Gitxsan nations have set up a camp for the last several years, physically blocking the construction of many pipelines, actually. One of them is Northern Gateway, and are successfully continuing to stop this construction. So that's a very significant project there. Then also going westward, we have Kinder Morgan, starts in Edmonton, ends in Burnaby. Of course, we did see this ongoing blockade in the fall. And in addition to that, there's also Burnaby City that's challenging the ability of Kinder Morgan to go through the city on the basis of municipal jurisdiction, that they have jurisdiction of their city. So that's an interesting case as well. Going south, we have Keystone XL pipeline, of course. 3 of the pipelines are actually in operation. It's the 4th that's awaiting approval and just got approved, but will likely be vetoed. And we've seen a lot of direct actions too around this, including ongoing tree sits in Texas, which were significant, and then this self-titled Indian and Cowboy Alliance that was doing a lot of actions in Washington. And then there's this other huge pipeline going south that doesn't get talked about and hasn't really been covered in the media. And it starts with the Alberta Clipper. It's line 67. And then it joins in with the Lakehead system in the US. So there's been very little media attention, also very little organizing, perhaps because it's an expansion project rather than a construction project. But with all the expansions that are planned, it would actually transport more oil than Keystone XL. So it's a very significant pipeline. It starts in Hardisty, Alberta, goes to Superior, Wisconsin, ships to Flanagan, which is near Chicago. This is now in other pipelines like Southern Line 61, and eventually ends up at the Gulf Coast in Texas. And this is via the Seaway pipeline. So again, very little resistance. Hopefully there could be more in the future. And then going eastward, we have Energy East, which is the most recent proposed pipeline. It would be the biggest in North America. Groups are starting to organize, communities are starting to express concerns. Some of it would be converted, like other pipelines that would be converted to tar sands pipeline, and other areas, new pipe would be built, so across Quebec and New Brunswick. So that'll be a very big fight. And there are also other smaller tar sands pipelines in the US, like Eastern Gulf Crude Access and Line 3 Replacement. And in this area, there's also some pipelines that are rumored to be in the process of being converted to tar sands pipelines, perhaps Line 10, Line 11, and so forth. And then also going east is Line 9. It's a smaller pipeline, but also significant because it would also allow for the expansion of the tar sands. This is a reversal project, so it's a 40-year-old pipeline that was built for regular oil, and now Enbridge wants to reverse the flow in order to send tar sands from Sarnia to Montreal, where it would continue on through the States and out for export. And we know that it's for export, despite right-wing media, because it's the reincarnation of the Trailbreaker project. This was a project that was set to connect what is Line 9 now to the Montreal-Portland pipeline, which goes through New Hampshire, Vermont, up and out into Maine. And the project was dropped in 2008 due to the recession and financial issues, and now it's being brought back in these smaller bits and pieces under a new name to try and disguise the project, but it's clearly the same project. And so in opposition to what you sometimes hear, that Line 9 is this national project and it's for Canada, it's probably not. It's probably getting exported out to Europe and other places. And in addition to concerns that this will allow for the expansion of the tar sands, there's also local concerns, as there are with all of the other pipelines. In the case of Line 9, because it's an old pipeline, the likelihood of it spilling is over 90% in the first 5 years of operation. And this is according to a pipeline safety expert who's had 40 years experience in the energy sector, Richard Kuprowicz. And this is problematic because the pipeline goes through heavily populated areas, big cities. It goes through 18 First Nations communities or close to them, many of whom have not been consulted, and I'll get into that a little bit more. It goes through highly racialized communities like Jane and Finch and others, and through many rivers that go into Lake Ontario that millions of Ontarians depend on for drinking water, which would be impacted by a spill into any of these rivers. And we've calculated that possibly 9.1 million people could be impacted if there was a spill. So a lot of local concerns as well. And the reason a spill is so likely is because, just for folks who may not be following this stuff, is because, as Keith explained, the bitumen is a very heavy substance, and it's much heavier than regular oil. So it has to be transported at a higher temperature, at a higher pressure. It's thicker going through the pipes, and that's why it's more likely to rupture the pipe and spill. And when it does spill, there's a bigger impact on health because the dilbit has to be cut with carcinogenic chemicals in order to help it go through the pipelines. And so these carcinogens evaporate into the air after a spill and make people sick. And the third difference is that if it spills into a waterway, it sinks to the bottom of water rather than rising to the top as regular oil does, which makes it very difficult to clean up. And these are all the things that we saw in the Kalamazoo spill in Michigan in 4.5 years ago now. And the river there is dead. They haven't been able to recover it. People got sick and so forth. And the biggest concern for at least a lot of the people I organize with around Line 9 is the Indigenous rights and the lack of consultation that happened in many of the communities around here. And as Heather noted, according to the Constitution, Section 35, communities have a right to be consulted on projects that would impact them. And we know at least 3 communities that have come out publicly saying that they weren't properly consulted, including Chippewa, the Thames, Kahnawake, and Aamjiwnaang First Nation. And according to the report, Not Worth the Risk, which I recommend reading, Line 9 also violates a number of treaties, including the Turo Wampum, the Nanfan, the Haldeman Treaty, Simcoe Deed, Huron Tract Treaty, and others. And one of the communities that would be highly impacted by the pipeline is Aamjiwnaang First Nation. This is where the pipeline comes above ground. It's where it starts. This is a community, I should mention, that is right beside Sarnia and right beside Chemical Valley, which is considered the most polluted place in North America, according to National Geographic. And this is also where tar sands refining is already happening, for example, at the Suncor refinery, and this is a toxic process. And of course, this is in addition to 63 other high-emitting facilities which are impacting people there negatively. And now there's a plan for a fourth refinery, and this one would be also for dilbit tar sands refining, a $10 billion bitumen upgrader project. And so all of these things would further devastate the community that's already experiencing health impacts from being in the middle of Chemical Valley, seeing high rates of cancers, these endocrine disruptions that are leading to birth ratios that are skewed, so 3 boys born for every girl, and things like this that are already a big problem. And the last thing is that Aamjiwnaang and Sarnia have a bunch of other pipelines. A co-organizer has coined the term "all pipes lead to Sarnia," which isn't the case. I mean, there are other places with lots of pipelines, but in the case of Sarnia, there's Line 5, 6B, 7, 9C. So, you know, perhaps there's preparation to do more tar sands refining, and this would be catastrophic, actually. And so for all of these reasons, people around here have been organizing against Line 9. There are groups across southern and southwestern Ontario that have been organizing. I'll talk more about Toronto because that's where I've been involved for the last few years. But ASAP, for example, Aamjiwnaang and Sarnia Against Pipelines has been very active in protesting the pipeline and Chemical Valley as well. So they've done toxic tours and other direct actions. Here in Toronto, there are a bunch of groups that were formed specifically to organize against Line 9, and we've come together in a coalition to do work around this. So one of the things we've worked on is a provincial campaign to get an environmental assessment to happen, just so we can raise more awareness by time. And this is because environmental assessments at the federal level had been cancelled by the Harper government in one of the omnibus bills. Now it's up to provinces to do these assessments, like it or not. The Kathleen Wynne government has refused. I'll try this one instead. The government of Kathleen Wynne has refused to do an environmental assessment. They've deferred to the federal government and the National Energy Board, both of whom we know are committed to expanding the tar sands at any cost. So that's not helpful at all. We've also worked on a municipal campaign, and that had led to several interesting motions in Toronto City Council. The last one in August led to a motion being passed to ask Enbridge not to transport tar sands through the city. But of course, Enbridge ignored this request. And this municipal campaign is ongoing. It's now turned into a campaign to prevent tar sands dilbit from coming through the city through any pipelines and rail, which is important because we do have tar sands going through the city through rail. And we did a lot of rallies and things like that as well. But I think one of the most successful tactics, at least here, was blockades. And I mean in terms of raising awareness, getting other people inspired to take action, and especially media coverage, which really grew and which has been pretty consistent on this campaign, was a result of blockades, and there were 7 over the course of a year. It started last year, 2 summers ago. It was a 6-day blockade at the North Westover pump station. And then in this winter, so last winter, there was a lockdown to machinery in Toronto. 5 people locked down. And then this past spring and summer, we had a wave of blockades, 5 of them. It was a very exciting time. Mostly 1 or 2 day blockades. So one in Burlington, Etobicoke, North Dumfries on Six Nations territory in Toronto. And the second last one was Dam Line 9 that took place in Innerkip near Woodstock. And that was a 6-day blockade of an Enbridge worksite. And on the last day, 2 activists locked themselves to barrels filled with concrete so that they couldn't be removed from the worksite because they felt so strongly about the project and they wanted to stand up for Indigenous rights. So we had some really powerful actions, and now the media is covering these letters that are going back and forth from the NEB and Enbridge, and I think it's because all of this work together created a lot of awareness and a lot of pressure, and it was mostly a grassroots campaign, so it is quite amazing. And so now the update, and one more, actually very important part of this is that Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, it's just south of London, is appealing the National Energy Board's approval of Line 9 on the basis of their treaty rights because they were not consulted on the project. And there's a petition online on League Now if you want to support that, that legal challenge. And the current situation is that, well, first of all, Enbridge is planning to go ahead with this pipeline despite the fact that there's this community that is challenging the legal rights to go on, for Enbridge to go online. And it's hoping to go online in June now. It was planning to go online in October, but the National Energy Board refused their application on the basis that some safety requirements weren't met, and it was specifically around safety valves not being in place on both sides of major waterways. These are valves that would prevent the oil from moving along in the case of a spill, so it would decrease the impact. But we were kind of assuming that it was probably because of all this pressure that the National Energy Board did this. It's ordinarily a rubber stamping organization, and so we do expect it to eventually rubber stamp the process. But this was a small victory that they couldn't ignore all this pressure and all this attention around Line 9. So now only 6 of the 104 major water crossings that Enbridge has identified anyway have these safety valves, and so now we're saying that a lot of these other waterways are going to be sacrifice zones, right? And they're going to experience something like what happened in Kalamazoo. So that's where the Line 9 campaign is, and I think while it's really important to organize against pipelines and the tar sands and other energy projects, I think it's also important to think about the wider picture and the system that we're living in, which leads to these decisions being made to build dirty energy projects that only benefit a few at the top who are profiting and are actually sacrificing people and environments, and at this point the planet. And of course the system is capitalism. It's based on infinite profit making, which requires infinite production and infinite consumption. infinite resources. And so we're always going to see new projects like this pop up, and we're constantly going to have to fight them if we continue to live under a system that puts the profit for a few ahead of the well-being of people and the environment. So I think alongside the organizing, which is crucial because people are being impacted right now and the climate situation is dire, I think it's important to also organize around building a new system that would put people at the center of decision making. There would be democratic decision making, not just a few people making decisions on what would be produced based on what's profitable for them, but people deciding, a very democratic system that would be locally based, horizontal, and all these things that actually would make better decisions in the first place, and have everyone deciding what is best for everyone rather than a few elites deciding what's best for them. Thanks.